Warning. The following podcast features views and opinions that are likely to trigger the extreme fanboys and fangirls who disagree with them. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to another episode. I'm actually kind of nervous. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm nervous about today.
Why are you nervous?
Because I have a very special guest, Mr. SCOTT MANTZ. You are like Mr. Star Trek.
Oh, come on, Billy. I'm the one who's nervous.
I am nervous because usually I'm able to, I'm pulling in my friends and everything to do this, but I never really talked to like the guy, the expert. I mean, you were pretty much signed off by Quinto and Pine as like Mr. Star Trek.
Oh, those guys are great, right. Quinto and Pine. I mean, doing those interviews for those three films, the Star Trek 2009, Into Darkness in 2013, and then finally Beyond in 2016. When you watch the full interviews that I did with him for each of those films, you could see the evolution of a bromance.
Absolutely.
It is so great, especially when you watch that first interview, because when I first met them, they were like, okay, he's that guy. He's
right.
on a freak show. But then they were like, wait a minute. So this guy loves Star Trek, and he's a film critic, and he loves this movie.
Right.
Wait a minute. That's a great thing. Like, I checked off all the boxes for everyone they wanted to love this movie. And I still think that 2009 film it's a great film. It's not just a great Star Trek movie. It's a great movie. Whereas the third film, Star Trek Beyond, of the three movies, Beyond felt more like a quote-unquote Star Trek movie, a Star Trek story, than the other two films did. Even though the second one turned into Wrath of Khan, a little
remix,
bit there,
yeah.
like a bizarro version of it. But I love all three of those movies, and if they never make a fourth with that cast, I'm happy because I love all of those films.
So already we can feel, even if you're just listening, you can feel the Trek energy, which we're going to go back a little bit in time today.
A little?
a little bit in time. We're going back to 1994, Star Trek Generations, 2 captains, 1 destiny.
Oh, wow. You quoted the poster.
Yeah, I did. I love it. Look, no matter how you feel about the movie, that was a cool poster,
That's
right?
A very cool poster.
That was a great poster.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of new listeners join the show. First of all, if you're new, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. This is not movie fights. This is actually a chance for me to talk with a friend, and your friends too, about really get in depth about, because some of these movies are very divisive, and I want to find out. I want to talk to someone who doesn't share my opinions. Maybe they can enlighten me. Maybe I can enlighten them. Maybe you'll feel enlightened too. So before we get into the actual movie, let's give a little bit of context. What was going on when this movie was made?
Whoa.
So we're going to go back a little bit to Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country in 1991. They thought, okay, this is the last Star Trek feature film with this cast moving forward. Let's go to Next Generation. So they came to Next Generation producer.
Wait, Billy, hang on. We got to give more context here for the 1991 film Star Trek.
Let's pause for yes, Mr. Star Trek.
Okay, first of all, you had the return as director of Nicholas Meyer.
This is true.
Who, by all accounts, really did direct the greatest Star Trek movie of them all, not just with the original series cast, but the Next Generation cast, the Kelvin Timeline cast. He directed the Wrath of Khan, which we can all agree is the Citizen Kane of Star Trek movies.
So glad this is the Wrath of Khan episode of the show, right?
But wait a minute. But
sure.
So the problem is that after Star Trek II was great, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, was good, not great. Star Trek IV was awesome, and of those movies, it was the one that appealed the most to non-fans. Right, it was the most mainstream. And then you had Star Trek V, the Final Frontier, directed by William Shatner, which is, it's just not a good movie. I think I've grown to appreciate it for what it is. It's a very earnest film.
Not through mostly his fault. Like some of it, but a lot of it was like, he
didn't have the budget to finish the
budget,
effects.
the timing was terrible.
The special effects are pretty bad in that movie, but they needed to go out on a high note, the original series cast, and they needed to do it on the 25th anniversary of Star Trek. And that's what The Undiscovered Country did. It was a movie that in many ways felt very Star Trek-y because it was an allegory for the fall of the wall. which just happened 2 years before.
Right.
And, that was what what made some of the best Star Trek episodes so great was that they were allegories. Next Generation was the same thing for our times. And, it wasn't as good as Wrath of Khan, but of all the Star Trek films, it's my second favorite of the original series movies. And it really was a sign-off in the literal sense, Billy, because at the ending credits, they signed their names.
That's absolutely true. So a fond farewell to the cast. We kind of knew that Next Generation was coming. So they informed Ronald D. Moore and Brandon Braga that they were going to make the next Star Trek film. They actually got pulled into the office. It's a funny story. And they thought that they were being told that Star Trek Next Generation was going to be canceled. They actually just found out they were going to be writing the film, which is pretty cool. There were some requirements that the studio said they must have. One of them was that they wanted the original cast to appear, but only for bookend purposes. They did not want this to be necessarily a Batman v Superman scenario. The other request, they wanted a Khan-like antagonist. They wanted Klingons to be involved, and they wanted a humorous data plot. So they went off. They wrote all of this. This is where Kirk's death was initially developed during story sessions. They knew they wanted a character to die. They threw around some next-gen cast members, and they were all kind of vetoed. And then someone just said, what about Kirk? And they all just went, yep, it's Kirk. They did offer this movie to Leonard Nimoy to direct as well as reprise the role of Spock. He said no on both accounts. And he even said, yeah, they literally didn't even change the lines. They just gave him all to Scotty.
To James Doohan and Walter Koenig.
Right.
More context, Billy, here is that 1994 was the last season of Next Generation.
Correct.
So you have the end of Next Generation coinciding with the first Star Trek Next Generation movie. So the series went off the air in like that spring, and then you had the film come out later in the year. Now here's the thing. The last episode of Next Generation, All Good Things, was an epic Star Trek episode.
Absolutely.
That really did bookend those 7 seasons of the Next Generation, which was a show that its first 2 years, I didn't really care for it that much.
That first season is rough.
And so is the second. So, Billy, that second season's terrible. But third season,
but go ahead.
Talking to Ron Moore and Brandon Braga,
sure.
When they came on in the third season, as well as some other producers, Michael Piller especially, that is when Next Generation hit its stride. That's when it got really, really good with episodes like Yesterday's Enterprise. Come on. So for the next 5 years, Star Trek The Next Generation was a solid and sometimes great, but always very, very good show. And it went out on a high note with All Good Things, which could and should have been the Next Generation movie. And if you're going to compare apples to apples, All Good Things versus Generations, for my money, All Good Things is a much better film. Like the stakes are so much higher. It's a more challenging film. It's a more ambitious, or episode rather. It's a more ambitious story with the way it brings together all these different timelines, past, present, and future. So when the cast was done filming All Good Things, the Next Generation cast, here they are filming the very last episode of the series that they were a part of for 7 years, except maybe Gates McFadden. Sure. She was there for like 5.5.
Right.
But what you're also having is they're being robbed of that final moment, that big goodbye, because they literally went from filming the last episode, All Good Things, into filming Generations. And you had the TV production step aside so that the film production could go underway. The cast is still working together, but the vibe on both counts between TV series and feature film were very, very different. And I think they all knew that the quality of that last episode versus the quality of the film were also very, very different.
Yeah, it's interesting too because they said that one of the initial pitches for the series finale was what we ended up seeing in Generations, which was the destruction of the Enterprise D. But they ended up saving that for the movie. So a little give and take there. Sure, I'll give you that. I want to ask you now, when this movie came out, I had not yet come into my Star Trek fandom
Interesting.
yet.
Okay.
That would come much later in my life. Mm-hmm. My Star Trek fandom started probably the worst time it could possibly happen, which was 7th grade. Because you have to remember, this is pre like the nerd renaissance where being nerdy and liking this stuff was cool. It was not. My email in 7th grade was Spock86 at StarTrekMail.com, and that was not cool, Scott.
No, Billy, that's cool now.
It's cool now. Like, I'm glad I had it, but so I want to ask, as a lifelong Star Trek fan, you are walking to the theater, you're seeing this poster, you're seeing Picard and Kirk on a poster come in November. What was your, go back in the time machine, what was your level of hype then and walking into that movie and surrounding this movie?
I'm gonna share a very special story with you, Billy.
Oh, I'm excited.
Because my time machine goes back a little further than that.
Oh, let's
because I was one of the select few that was part of an early test screening.
Wow.
For Star Trek Generations.
So you saw the alternate kind of...
I saw the alternate ending.
Right.
Where Kirk's death was very underplayed. It felt very like, that's it. Like, after all these years of Kirk sacrificing himself to save the Enterprise, save the galaxy, basically what you had in the original ending of Generations, the original ending that was screened for that test audience, was that, you know, they're having the big battle, you know, Kirk and Picard are teaming up against Sauron.
Right.
So at one point, there's a fight and Sauron gets knocked out. And everybody, and Kirk and Picard think that he's knocked out. So Picard goes up to stop the missile from launching.
Sure.
Okay. And while Kirk is watching Picard climb to the top of the tower to stop the missile from launching, Sauron gets up and shoots Kirk in the back. And that's how he dies.
That's pretty lame. That's pretty lame.
You know, and you know, so Kirk and Soren get into this big battle, and you know, the Nexus comes and goes, and whatever, and then you know, Picard goes down to check up on Kirk, who says his last words, which were not, "It was fun." It was fun, but then he doesn't go, "Oh my," but it just felt like, I remember we all just sort of like looked around at each other, because there were a lot of fans in the audience, and we all looked around at each other and went, really, that's it? That's how Kirk dies? He gets shot in the back? Like, I mean, come on. This guy has been through everything. I mean, he saved the Earth. You know, he brought back the whales into the future.
Right.
I mean, it just felt like this was not the big sacrificial death that Kirk should have gone out on. So when they reshot the film and they went back to Valley of Fire in, like, you know, whatever, 150-degree weather, and they reshot the ending, they made it much more dramatic, much more sensational, much more exciting. You know, you had the bridge falling, and, you know, Kirk, you know, trying to get the remote to the tower, and it was a much more epic battle. And ultimately, it was the bridge falling, and Kirk was on the bridge, and he fell along with it. That's what killed him. So then when he says his final words, "It was fun," you know, there's also a stillness in his eyes when he goes, "Oh my!"
Right.
Like
I love that moment.
This is death.
Yeah.
Okay. So the version that I saw for the first time was exactly the same as the version that was ultimately released in November, except for the ending. And when I saw the ending, when I saw the film when it came out, I went, okay, that's a much better ending.
Right.
But I still thought that compared to All Good Things felt more like a movie than Generations did. Generations is a movie that, on the whole, Billy, I do like it. Mm-hmm. It's not like, let's say, Nemesis.
Or Insurrection.
or Insurrection I actually like.
Okay. Oh.
You know, Insurrection is not bad. It's just not as good as First Contact.
That's the first one I saw theatrically, by the way.
You know, Insurrection it came out in 98. It's not a bad movie. It just, you know, it's like when you follow a great film, like Wrath of Khan, following Wrath of Khan with Search for Spock. Yeah, Search for Spock wasn't as good, even though you had the greatest moment of that film is where they steal the Enterprise.
Right.
And I remember being completely heartbroken when the Enterprise exploded, because that was the first time we saw an Enterprise destroyed. You know, it happened quite a few times. But with Generations, I liked the film. I love the bookends, the middle part, the Next Generation setting, just with Picard on the Enterprise with the crew. Unfortunately, that part felt like an episode.
Okay.
That part felt like a good episode, but part of the problem is that the director of the film, David Carson, he cut his teeth directing episodes of Next Generation. And the movie didn't feel theatrical enough. It didn't feel epic enough, despite what was at stake, despite the fact you have Kirk and Picard in the same movie, a real passing of the torch. It just didn't feel epic enough. Now, you might argue, well, what about Jonathan Frakes? He cut his teeth directing episodes of Next Generation, and he went on to direct, which was easily, hands down, the best Next Generation episode, which was First Contact. But, look, Frakes has it. Frakes had it. He was able to direct a movie like that, and
one take Frakes.
And he did a great job with First Contact.
I think for me, first of all, I was, I guess, lucky enough, maybe. This is a movie that definitely is a victim of its own expectations. There's a lot that this movie has to carry the weight of its shoulders when you say, like, Kirk and Picard teaming up. Like, you've already written that movie in your head the minute that's said. So I feel like I was able to watch this kind of in a vacuum. The first time I saw this much later than I did, because like I said, I went and saw the first Star Trek thing I ever saw was Insurrection, which is bonkers that would be something like to reel you in.
My first Star Trek movie that I saw in a theater was oh man, I'm dating myself here, Star Trek the motion picture, December 7th, 1979. I saw it on opening day, and my entry into Star Trek goes back to 1974. I was 6 years old, and at that time, growing up in Philadelphia, Star Trek played every night at 7 p.m. Weeknights, and I was definitely of the generation that discovered the original Star Trek in those reruns. I was part of that generation where Star Trek really found its audience, the audience that made Star Trek a success long after it was original run, the audience that helped turn Star Trek into the franchise that we know and love. 6 TV series and 13 movies later. Yeah,
I mean, I was a Star Wars guy, and I was like, Star Trek, too confusing. I don't know where to start. Because you have to remember, at this time, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, all this stuff is going on. I'm like, I don't even know where to start with this. Apparently, for whatever reason, I chose Insurrection as the jumping off point. But it was so cool because it's like when you discover, if you went and saw Iron Man in the theater and that's the first time you saw that character, and you're like, wait, there's like 60 years of backstories. Now I can really dig in. By the time I got to Star Trek, I had my pick of the litter of where I could go from there. And so when I got to Star Trek Generations, it wasn't like, all right, they've got a lot to prove here with these two captains. To me, it was just like, oh, cool. Like, this was always a Next Generation movie, you know?
Well, that's interesting. You and I really did come into Generations with two completely different perspectives.
Exactly,
I came into Generations with really a literal, lifelong love of Star Trek that started with the original series when I was 6 years old. Watching those episodes over, I used to hold my tape recorder up to the television. This is before we had a VCR, so this was like in the late 70s. I would hold up a tape recorder to the TV and record the audio of the episodes, and I would play the audio back because I didn't have a VCR yet.
Right.
So then when I got the VCR, I started taping them, I started buying certain episodes, and then Next Generation came on, and I grew to love Next Generation because it turned into a really, really great show that I love almost as much as the original series. So, and I loved All Good Things. So I went into Generations with huge expectations.
I think everyone did. I don't think that you can market the movie of like two captains, one destiny, and not walk in and already having written the fanfic in your mind. Like, and when you think about it, like Kirk's only in this movie for like maybe 10 minutes tops.
10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, it is brief. This is a Next Generation movie.
Those 10 or 15 minutes, Billy, are the best part of the movie.
But I mean, because it's Kirk. We know him. We love him. Shatner, first of all, I think this is as little as he's in it. I love Shatner in this movie because he's not milking the quote-unquote Shatnerisms. I feel like we've gotten to this point where when we think of William Shatner acting, it's like we think of the caricature, we think of the impression, we think of the parody. But I think when you look at a movie like Star Trek Generations, which, by the way, for my money, out of all the Star Trek movies, this is the least plot-driven. It is emotionally driven. And the nuance that Shatner can bring in this movie, especially like you said, that moment where he's just like, oh my. Like, it gives me chills every time.
I got to tell you, Billy, William Shatner's performance as Kirk, this is the role that he was born to play. And for evidence of this, I go back to the first pilot that Shatner filmed as Kirk. So everybody knows, everyone, you know, who knows anything about Star Trek knows that they filmed an episode of Star Trek with Captain Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter.
Right.
That didn't sell the series, but it got them to do a second pilot. That's where they recast everybody but Spock, brought in William Shatner to play Captain Kirk. And when you're watching that pilot episode where no man has gone before, and you're watching the scene in the rec room where Kirk and Spock are playing 3D chess, you know, you could see that the uniforms were different, the lighting was different. Spock looked very different. He smiled. Like, you could tell that Leonard Nimoy didn't really quite know how to play Spock yet.
Right.
It took him a few episodes. But from Act 1, Scene 1 of that first episode that he did, William Shatner had Kirk down. That was how he played the role for the next 30 years up until he died in Generations. And in terms of the caricatures, in terms of the imitations that you're talking about, there was that, because by the third season of that show, the budgets had gone down. Roddenberry had left the show basically as a day-to-day producer, and the replacing executive producer, Fred Freeberger, just didn't get really what that show was really all about. And in order to sort of compensate for the lack in quality of the scripts, Shatner kind of laid it on a little thick sometimes. But if you watch the first 2 seasons of that series, season 1 and season 2, Shatner was right on. He hit the nail on the head with how to play this character. And in episodes like Sitting on the Edge of Forever, The Enemy Within, Metamorphosis, The Conscience of the King, like, he was spot on. So then you fast forward to Wrath of Khan, which I thought, you know, even though people could make fun of the Khan moment, his performance in that film was really his finest hour. You know, at the end when he's, you know, totally broken down and David goes to see him in his quarters and he's like, I poured myself a drink. Would you like it? Like, he's unraveling. I mean, it was a really brilliant performance. And in Generations, the first part of that movie on the Enterprise B, you know, when Kirk and Scotty and Chekhov are just there because they were part of the Enterprise
Sure.
A, you know, and they're legends. And then, you know, the Enterprise B hits the Nexus, and Captain Harriman is like worthless. So the scene, I love the scene. It's so subtle. But when Shatner as Kirk, you know, he sits in the captain's chair and he like sits there like, I'm back.
Right. Yeah.
Right. He's got that look like I'm back, and he just goes, no. He goes, no. Your place is here. You're the captain of the ship. Like, it's a great moment because the emotional, the dramatic shift in like, yeah, Kirk he's back. He's commanding the Enterprise again. And you can tell he's like, oh, yes, this chair feels so good.
Right.
I'm back. I'm
like a
back
drug.
in command, right? This is what he was born to do, was be a captain of the Enterprise. And you know, in a split second, he gets his bearings and he says, no, your place is here. But he does the more heroic thing by going down and he's like fixing the computer and he says, that's it, let's go. And the Enterprise B gets out of there, you know, with consequences. Kirk is gone. And when he shows up in the second part, you know, and, you know, they're having that conversation, Picard and Kirk. This is where Generations kind of missed the boat.
Okay, let's get into this.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love the scene.
This is where they're chopping wood.
Where they're
in the
chopping
house.
wood and they're riding the horses, and
Sure.
he goes, I take it the outlook is grim. Sounds like fun.
Yeah.
But Kirk is there with the love of his life, Apollonia.
Antonia.
Who the hell?
Prince is Apollonia. I think Prince would have something to say.
Antonia.
Yeah.
Antonia?
Yeah.
Who the hell is Antonia?
So from what I read, they wanted to do Carol Marcus, but there was some sort of holdup on the red tape side that they couldn't have it be Carol Marcus.
What about Edith Keeler?
I mean, it could have been
That's
a
who
handful.
it should have been.
Right.
That's who it should have been. Because if Wrath of Khan is the Citizen Kane of Star Trek movies, then City on the Edge of Forever is the Citizen Kane of Star Trek episodes.
Sure.
This is the one, Edith Keeler, played by Joan Collins, and Kirk has to make the ultimate sacrifice to either save Edith from being hit by a car and altering the future, the Enterprise, Starfleet, none of that happens, or letting her die as she was intended to do and restoring the future, restoring the Enterprise, restoring the Federation, everything. And he makes the ultimate sacrifice for this woman who really was his match. And she only had, in one episode, you don't even see Edith Keeler until the middle of the second act.
Right.
Yet you bought into their connection. You really felt like they were soulmates.
Which is interesting because in the novel for Star Trek Generations, they obviously can take the time to do scenes that just weren't possible in this movie.
Sure.
And one of them is when Kirk isn't. The movie makes it seem like Kirk's just getting there too, because time makes no difference. But in the novel, he's been jumping around to different things all this time, and one of them that was included was altering that episode and that outcome.
Yeah. I mean, but for to watch that movie, and yeah, you're right. I mean, Carol Marcus would have been great because I mean they did have David together, and it would have been a great sort of like through line for the films.
Sure.
But to have this like Kirk be there with this woman that is his love of his life, and it's someone we've never even known or met or seen any picture of her. We don't know what her face is, but Edith Keeler, even more than Carol Marcus, I think, between the two women, Kirk, between Edith and Carol Marcus, I think most fans will agree that Edith Keeler was absolutely emotionally Kirk's best match that he ever had as a love interest.
So this is where you and I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier. This is where we diverge, because I think this movie, again, is a victim of Star Trek fans' expectations. When I watch this movie, I am more invested in the emotional idea of it. And this was something that came up later on in pop culture. I mean, this has been in philosophy for thousands of years, but this idea really popped back up with The Matrix. Like, if you were presented a reality which was pleasing to you, but you knew it wasn't real, would you accept it or reject it?
Right. Which
Star Trek Generations handles also here. And you were talking about Kirk's kind of obsession with being captain, but being able to stop himself and kind of quote unquote do the right thing. And it's very interesting that we have Picard, who also shows up and has to make a tough choice because he wants to stay in that emotional reality. And then you have Sauron, who is on the opposite, and he gives in to this desire to be happy. And I think that's where, like, the emotionality of all of this really resonates with me, because I love this idea that Sauron isn't this guy who wants power. I love when Guinan's like, he doesn't care about power. He doesn't care if you live or die. All he cares about is feeling happy. And I feel like as someone who does like suffer from anxiety and all of us, we're all, we're looking for inner peace. Mm-hmm. This idea that inner peace is this obtainable place if you could get to it. There's something about that just resonates with me and makes this movie more than just, look, I love Wrath of Khan. Love it. I have nothing bad to say about it. But that is a revenge flick. That is a really freaking cool revenge flick with some very heavy themes within it.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
This is like almost, to me, completely like a philosophical story, which sometimes made Star Trek really great.
Oh, absolutely it did, Billy. I mean, the philosophical points of Star Trek are what resonated to me the most. Mm-hmm. And the philosophical aspect of Star Trek is what separated Star Trek from other franchises. I mean, Star Wars has its own spiritual bent with the Force, which, I love Star Wars. I really do.
You don't have to choose one or the other. Yeah.
You can love them both. But, it's because I've been a Star Trek fan longer. Sure. I discovered it first. And I think that the thing that gives Star Trek the edge to me over Star Wars is that it's a little more grounded in familiar plausibility. Like, it's our future. It's not a galaxy far, far away.
Right.
And it's a hopeful future. It's very positive. It's not post-apocalyptic or dystopian. And you know what? Kirk was a great role model. He was a great hero for me growing up. He still is. But the point that you brought up at the top of this conversation about Sauron, Malcolm McDowell, okay, he's kind of a weak villain in a sense, comparing, you said that at the top of this conversation that they were looking for a Khan-esque villain.
Antagonist, right.
Okay. Well, the Khan-esque antagonist had a deep history with Kirk.
Sure, right.
So you have that, like when you watch that episode from '67, Space Seeding, you see Khan like just at the prime of his physical prowess. Mm-hmm. trying to steal the Enterprise.
I would almost argue that this movie actually, like the one thing I have in my notes that actually does not work for me at all and I wish was out were the Klingon Sisters.
Yeah.
Because they tried to make an antagonist and to me it's like, what if Sauron really was just blowing up the star because that's all he wanted, and it wasn't like he didn't have to do other dastardly things to be like, guys, this is the villain. Like, what if he was never a clear villain? He was just a man on a mission, and yeah, he's gonna have some collateral damage. I think that would have been stronger for this movie, but obviously they're like, no, we have to have some form of evil. So like those Klingon sisters are
but I think they go for the form of evil, sort of a sympathetic evil with Sauron, because he wants to get reunited with his family, and in the Nexus, and he's obsessed with it, and he's willing to destroy a whole a civilization to get there.
But I don't think he's like an evil dude. I think like if his family never died, he wouldn't be out in the galaxy like capping people. Whereas I feel like a character like Khan knew he was superior, and no matter where he was, I think he would have probably gone towards a dark side.
But also, the elements that made Wrath of Khan so great where it was more than a revenge flick. It was an allegory for Moby Dick.
Sure.
It was Shakespearean. I mean, the Khan is Ahab, and the Enterprise is the whale. Again,
not taking anything away from Wrath of Khan with what I'm saying, because I love that movie.
I mean, like the whole thing with the Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I mean, Wrath of Khan it's brilliant, it's poetic, it's timeless. Whereas I don't think that Generations, again, I could watch the movie right now and I would enjoy it very much. Mm-hmm. But, when we get to the middle part, which we really haven't talked enough about yet, Billy, let's just talk about, like how do you, taking the Kirkness out of the bookends of the movie, how do you think the actual Next Generation setting of this film, how does that hold up for a theatrical experience?
I mean, for me, again, like you have to remember, watching this in a vacuum, it didn't seem like it was like... It didn't seem that different to me. It just was like, okay, here's the Next Generation. That's the bridge I know. That's the crew I know. Now, I will say, the one thing in this movie that drives me bananas is just the mishmash of uniforms. Like, it is so like, that's where I'm like, okay, you did this on the cheap, because no one wears the same uniform. They kind of change between scenes. Like, okay, you're wearing the Deep Space Nine one. You have some funky one I've never seen. Like, I know that's such like a weird
That's
nitpick,
a little bit of a nitpicky thing, but okay.
But it is like that was the cool thing about Star Trek, like the not motion picture, but at least 2 through 6 was I loved that they all kind of had these like militaristic uniforms, and then they changed, instead of having a blue shirt or yellow shirt, it was like the kind of the tunic under it was how you knew their rank. Like that was cool. Mm-hmm. This one was a little bit like, all right, just go in the back, and if you see a red one, doesn't matter what style, just grab it. And they don't. Sometimes they really don't. Frakes looks like he dry cleaned his a little too warm, and Geordi looks like he shrunk a little in his at times.
I was at a restaurant a few months ago, and I saw Malcolm McDowell. And I went, oh my God, that's the guy who killed Kirk. And I just like wanted to say something to him, but I didn't want to be that guy. I mean, I've been that guy enough.
But I think, to your point of the actual Next Generation piece, it does feel like an episode. Yeah. It does feel like an episode. Mm-hmm. And people say that as a criticism, but to me, I'm like, they're like, oh, it plays like a really good episode. I'm like, what's wrong with that? Like, I would rather see a good adventure with these people. And I do think that because this movie is very somber, borderline morose, that it has its own feel to it. And for me, like, it has a darker kind of like, the tension is not so much like what's going to happen, but more just like, are we okay here? Like, and I kind of, as I get older, I appreciate this more, because I feel like where First Contact kind of does a 180, and it's like, we were a little heavy on the emotions. Let's go bigger action. And don't get me wrong, I love that movie too.
Yeah, I love First Contact.
But I don't really think, like, nothing in First Contact makes me really like question and think and question myself. But seeing Picard in grief while also seeing Data learn what emotions are and how to handle them, and it's almost like I feel that way sometimes too. It's like, how do you control how you feel? Because here's Data who's learning it, here's Picard who's shutting it out, and here's Sauron who can't get over it, is obsessed with it and hurting others because he can't deal with it. Like, that's powerful stuff to me.
Also the other issue I had with Generations is, You know, how many times are they going to destroy the Enterprise?
At least a couple more.
I mean, you know, even in Beyond, you know, in Star Trek Beyond, when
Right.
the Enterprise gets destroyed, I'm like, I mean, stop. You know, like you're going for a shock value. Nothing is ever going to top the shock value of the Enterprise getting destroyed in Star Trek 3. I mean, that was the Enterprise.
And they had that great lead up sequence to it where they give those self-destruct codes.
Yeah,
They're like, are you really going to do this, or are you going to pull out?
The,
You know?
the self-destruct sequence, which they used, it was the same exact destruct sequence that Kirk used to bluff Beale and Lokai in the episode "Let That Be Your Last Battlefield." It was the exact same sequence, which was very, very cool. But then, you know, when they start doing the destruct sequence, and then James Horner's music sort of kicks in, you're like, wow, they're really going for it. And the way that Leonard Nimoy, who directed the third film, the way he shot the destruction of the Enterprise was very dramatic. Because first, the bridge, the actual bridge blows apart. Then you see the words NCC 1701 USS Enterprise. You see it disintegrate.
Right.
And then the primary hull just blows up. And that was, to me, as a 15-year-old, just as shocking as when Spock died in The Wrath of Khan. You know, because I knew that Spock would be back, because my dad was like, don't worry, he's going to be back.
Right, sure.
But, you know, this was, even though it was a refit version of the Enterprise from the original series, you know, the Enterprise in the original series never blew up and never got destroyed. And then you had, you know, there was a refit and for the motion picture, and that's the version you see in The Wrath of Khan. And so the Enterprise was always there. The Enterprise was like a member of the cast. So seeing the Enterprise blow up in Search for Spock felt like losing a cast member. Now, Enterprise D, yes, that is a member of the Next Generation cast, but it was almost like, oh, let's destroy the Enterprise again.
Sure.
And it didn't work, you know, even though I love the Enterprise E. The Enterprise E was all
Sleek.
badass.
Yeah.
You know, that's what the Enterprise D should have been, because it did. I mean, you know, even though you're in space, there's something about having an aerodynamic look that
Right.
makes a ship look cool. Look at the X-wing fighter, or look at the Viper from Battlestar Galactica. You know, those are cool-looking spaceships.
Right.
And the Enterprise E looked like a cool-looking spaceship, and it was huge. But just there was something about, you know, when the Enterprise D, it separated from the saucer, you know, saucer section, separated, and then it crashes on the planet. I mean, it was very dramatic, and it was very suspenseful, you know, watching it skid to a stop like that. You felt the urgency of it.
Poor Troy. They let her drive one time.
I know, right? Yeah. Never. Give me the keys.
Right into the
Give me the keys. But, you know, like, it just felt like gimmicky, like, you know, when you see the Enterprise start to go in the planet, to the atmosphere, and Data goes, oh shit.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it just felt like a cheap stunt.
Yeah, look, I'm not even going to argue with you on that, because I do feel like, to me, this movie is really about Picard and Sauron and that whole emotional plot. And it's almost like you just have to deal with everyone else. And so what do? Just, I don't know, just to have them blow up or something. It doesn't matter. And I get it. I get that that's like, it's somewhat anticlimactic. It's like, we know, you know, that eventually they're going to be back in another Enterprise, whatever. We just got to give them something
Right,
to do.
sure.
But and I'll even give you too, like, we've spent so much time on that Data storyline that to just have him sit on the sideline while all the other stuff is happening, it's kind of like, it's a little bit of a bummer. But again, if I just think of this, like, a lot of times for me, and this is why it's very hard, and I don't know how you do it as a critic, it's very hard for me to be like, this is bad, this is good. I always walk away like, what did I feel? What did I think? And you're right, I don't feel or think anything about the Enterprise crashing in this one like I did in Search for Spock. Mm-hmm. But when I think of all the other Star Trek movies, and I think about which one touched me in a way that, like, hit a nerve or made me really think about myself or just life in general, it's Generations. Because I always think, I'm like, what would I do if I was in the Nexus? What if I was given everything I wanted and someone ripped me out of that? It didn't ask me, just gave me paradise and ripped me away from it.
Yeah.
What would I do? And I think, like, as much as I love all the other ones, like, those to me are stories, and this to me is like posing this question that I can think about for hours. And like I said, the darker tone. I love the score in this one.
Yeah,
and I know that it was Dennis McCarthy,
Dennis McCarthy.
and all he does, or not all he does, but really what he's known for is just Star Trek series music.
Yeah, TV
but I
shows,
think he knocked it out of the park. There's even from that first kind of opening credits where we see the bottle, and it's just kind of like this otherworldly, haunting, the Nexus theme kind of playing. Like, I don't know. It just it stuck with me, you know?
Yeah, look, I get it. You know, I mean, look, as a critic, I always go with what I feel, and
Sure.
it could be any number of things that make me feel a certain way. I never approach the same film, you know, movies the same way. There's always something that's different. But with the Star Trek movies, you know, again, the Kelvin timeline films, those movies are really special because. You know, now that we've gone back to having Star Trek on TV with Discovery, which I have to say, the second season of Star Trek Discovery was a big improvement
Agreed.
over the first season.
Agreed.
Like, I mean, the whole boring Klingon storyline done, like they just kind of kicked it to the curb. And I got to tell you, Anson Mount as Captain Christopher Pike, he brought so much levity to that show, to that season. I would pay good money to watch a spin-off series featuring Captain Pike on the Enterprise. You know, you only saw one other voyage with him, and that was the first Star Trek episode that was ever filmed, The Cage.
Yeah.
But how awesome would it be if you're going to do a prequel series, put Star Trek back on the Enterprise and put Captain Christopher Pike in command, Anson Mount as the captain of the Enterprise. I felt like he had more eagerness, more earnestness. He had that sort of charm and swagger that Shatner brought to Kirk. Now, granted, Captain Pike was played very differently by Jeffrey Hunter in the first episode, and Jeffrey Hunter's Captain Pike is more like Picard than he is like Kirk. But I just thought season 2 was great, and Star Trek is back on TV where it belongs. Plus, you have the Orville, which is an unofficial Star Trek series in its own right. But as far as the feature films, you know, the ones that stand out to me as the very best movies, are The Wrath of Khan, The First Contact, and Star Trek 2009. Those are the best Star Trek movies. And they all felt like movies. There was a lot at stake in those films. And the you know, Wrath of Khan especially, I've loved that movie ever since I saw it on June 4th, 1982 for the first time. And I loved it then, and now I love it for different reasons, because in terms of the way Kirk is coming to terms with his age and his purpose.
Sure.
As, you know, now that I'm almost as old as Kirk was in The Wrath of Khan, I'm finding myself relating to The Wrath of Khan in a way that I never thought that I would.
Right.
So I didn't see that coming, but that's certainly where I am at this stage in my life, and why Wrath of Khan continues to amaze me in the different ways that has paid off in so many ways. I still think that Generations is right in the middle. Didn't love it, didn't hate it. I liked it. I'd watch it again, and I'd enjoy the heck out of it. I thought that the bookend parts were much better than the middle part. I think it's an uneven film. I think it's kind of a missed opportunity, but I'm glad we got what we got.
I think for me, that's the thing. It's like there's definitely a difference, because what is the best Star Trek movie? It's Wrath of Khan.
It's
like
Wrath of Khan.
I'm not going to argue
Come
that
on,
at all.
man. Yeah.
What is my favorite Star Trek movie is Generations.
And
but that goes exactly to what you just said, and it's like, and I think that's what's so cool about things like Star Wars, things like Star Trek, things like even Marvel movies or Batman, is that you find something new in Wrath of Khan that relates to you that maybe the Scott in the 80s wouldn't feel, and you would take something away differently. Just like Generations, for me, I think is a movie that I've grown into even more, because it asks something different of me, and depending on where I am, maybe I think a little bit differently about it. So for me, Star Trek Generations is my favorite. Also because it feels like when you look at all actually, let's take Star Trek the motion picture out of it, because I feel like it has a lot in common, like tonally, with the motion picture.
Philosophically.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But from 2 to all the way to Star Trek Beyond, Star Trek Generations kind of feels like the odd man out. Like, it feels like it doesn't match, like, thematically, tonally, kind of even stylistically. It feels odd, and that could be a turnoff, but to me, that's what, like, kind of attracts me a little bit to it.
Yeah.
And that's why I say, like, I think everyone has the same reaction. Favorite Star Trek movies? Generations? And it's like, I'm not saying it's the best.
It's your favorite.
My favorite.
Hey,
I love that Star Trek is that malleable.
Embrace
that you and I
your
can,
taste, Billy.
right? That everyone can take something different away from it, and maybe there's someone out there. So we don't know who he is or who she is, but someone out there. Nemesis is the one that speaks to them. I don't know what it
if you're
says,
listening
but-
to this and you love Nemesis, if you're listening to this podcast and Star Trek Nemesis is your favorite Star Trek movie, hit me up at Movie Mantz on Twitter.
We want to talk to you.
I want to know who you are. But listen, Star Trek the Motion Picture is a movie that a lot of people, especially people who've never seen Star Trek the Motion Picture, oh, that's the boring one. Well, just like you feel that Generations is the odd man out of the 13 Star Trek movies, I feel like the motion picture is the odd man out.
Oh, for sure.
Because first of all, it was the first one. The look of that film with the special effects by Douglas Trumbull, the music of that film with the incredible score by Jerry Goldsmith.
So we got the next gen theme from.
Exactly. And
the uniforms are different.
Uniforms are different. And also, you're seeing the triumvirate of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, but they're not quite getting along because they haven't been together for 2.5 years. And Kirk's been sitting behind a desk. McCoy went off to do private practice again. Spock is off to getting the Colin-R. And when he comes back to the Enterprise, Kirk and McCoy are like, what's his motive here? Is he really here for us? Or is he here for himself? And Kirk doesn't even know his way around his own starship because he pulled a dick move from Decker to get it back. So, a lot of people felt like, well, this isn't how I remember the characters from the original series. And I agree with that feeling. But chronologically, and for a narrative point of view, the way that the characters have to rediscover who they are to themselves and to each other, it made sense that that's where they were in their lives. They had to learn how to work together again, learn how to love each other again, learn how this new Enterprise works. From that standpoint, I think the motion, and also definitely from the philosophical, spiritual standpoint, from the cerebral standpoint of that movie, I love the movie. But of the things that people diss Star Trek the Motion Picture about how Kirk, Spock, and McCoy weren't like the way we remembered them, that's what I like about them, because they had to get back to who they were. And by this time the second movie came out 3 years later, I'm like, that's Star Trek.
Yeah. And I think it's funny too, because like if I'm going to do a complete rewatch, it's like, yeah, if I'm not 100% feeling it, I might just start with Wrath of Khan because it's a great trilogy. 2, 3, 4.
It is a great trilogy.
It's a great trilogy. Up there with the best, in my opinion. But yeah, look, Star Trek Generations, it's one it's special to me. It's one that I enjoy revisiting probably more than others at points. I totally understand, especially like super hardcore Star Trek fans, that there probably are a lot of missed opportunities. I also think there's a lot of cool stuff in it that they might dig. I kind of think it's unintentionally ironic that Kirk is buried in rocks, just like he buried his friend Gary Mitchell at the end of...
Where No Man Has Gone Before.
Yeah, he was
buried under a big rock.
Yeah, well, he was... the circumstances were a little different, but I'm saying like there's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in it. I love the idea of the Nexus. It's something that I'm always going to think about.
Command and compassion is a fool's mixture.
And I love too, like, time is a predator. It is the fire in which we burn. And I love that by the end, Picard's like, time's a companion, because if we were immortal and there was no such thing as time, we would never kind of know what we had. Like, that's what makes it great. There are some terrible things in it. I think the Klingon Sisters are bad.
Yeah, I'm with you on
I wish
that.
I could take it out.
Yeah,
I wish
you
I really
can get
could.
rid of them,
right?
And no one would care.
I think I like the Data plot. I think there are places where they kind of milk it a little too much. I'm like, all right, reel it in a little bit. I get it. He's got emotions. Now he's becoming obnoxious.
Right.
Life
forms.
Life forms. Like, it's like, all right, let's take it easy.
Cute, yeah.
But for the most part, I love the emotionality of this movie. And again, like, there's Star Trek. I wish people didn't see Star Wars has this thing where it's like this timeless thing, and Star Trek, I feel like even though we've broken through a little bit, it still has this stigma of like, well, that's too nerdy. Like, some people think like, oh, Star Trek, that's a little too much, but I wish they would open up a little bit more.
Well, you know, I think the holdover from that goes back to something you said at the top of this conversation. When you were growing up, you had this email at a time when being a nerd wasn't cool.
Right.
Okay, so going back a little further than that, when I was growing up and I was going to, you know, middle school and going to high school, and I was a freaking card-carrying Star Trek fan. I loved Star Trek, and I talked about it with everyone, whether they wanted to hear about it or not. I mean, I wore...
Clearly a lot's changed.
Yes, nothing has changed. Everybody else has changed. I've stayed the same. But you know, like back in the early 70s when you had the conventions, and the conventions, you know, we're all part of that generation that discovered Star Trek in syndication. And you know, this is like a couple years before Star Wars opened, and that really did change everything. And that was, Star Wars was the reason why Star Trek went from being another TV series to a feature film, but that's a whole other story. But the holdover from the convention aspect of it was that Star Trek was for geeks and for nerds, and in any form of entertainment, whether it's movies, TV, or even sports, you're going to have a certain percentage of fans that go overboard. Like, look at a college football game in Wisconsin in like January, and it's like negative 30 degrees, and people are wearing paint,
right, body paint,
color,
yeah.
You know, and yet no one makes fun of them, but people make fun of a Star Trek fan for dressing up at a convention. I mean, it's not really fair. But even though fandom has grown in leaps and bounds, and the types of movies and the people who watched them were ridiculed, you know, 30 years ago, those are the people who are making these movies. Like Black Panther grossed $1.3 billion worldwide. You know, when Avengers opens, I mean, that's going to be the fastest movie to hit $1 billion worldwide, no question about it. But these people are, you know, are sort of, they're the ones. I mean, that's why Comic-Con has grown in leaps and bounds. I mean, that's why everyone is looking for their own Marvel Cinematic Universe. Star Wars tried it. You know, Star Trek is doing it on TV with all these different shows that are coming along. And it's true, the geeks have inherited the earth.
They finally have. Scott, I could talk Star Trek with you for days.
I know.
For days straight.
Right back at you.
I love Star Trek, and I love SCOTT MANTZ. Two of my favorite things, all in this episode. Thank you so much, at Movie Mantz.
Yes, sir.
Hit up Scott, especially if you're the Nemesis person.
Yeah, if you love Nemesis, I mean, now that it's not just that you love Nemesis.
Your favorite.
If it is your number one favorite Star Trek movie of all time, I want to know who you are. Right. Hit us up, baby. Hit me up on Twitter at Movie Mantz. I want to know. Billy, this was a great conversation.
I love it. Thank you so much for stopping by. Thank you so much for listening. Rate and review on iTunes, all that fun stuff. But most importantly, to all of you listening, live long and prosper.